What is Linux? Linux is a family of free and open source software operating systems built around the Linux kernel. 25 years ago, Linux 1.0 was developed, and at that time, it was never imagined to be installed on 1 million computers all around the world. Linux has a completely free and open source kernel, meaning it can be freely used for any purpose you want. This paper takes you on a brief journey through Linux, with a quick high-level overview of the kernel and its structure. We will also look at some of the devices that might run on the Linux kernel. It comes in many different flavors called distributions. We will look at some of these and then take a short dip into the gaming environment with Linux. Typically, Linux is packaged in a form known as a Linux distribution for both desktop and server uses. The defining component of a Linux distribution is a Linux kernel. What is the kernel? The Linux kernel is the central part of the operating system that links your hardware with the applications. In 1991, Linus Torvalds did not set out to develop the Linux kernel. Instead, he just wanted an easier way to work on his computer. It just started out a personal project as a better terminal emulator with a lot of added enhancements. It is comprised of many utilities, commands, and libraries to make using the computer easier for technical people. The kernel was enhanced to the point that an operating system was born named FreeAX version 0.01. 6 months later, this operating system was renamed to Linux, and the source code was made freely accessible by FTP. The Linux kernel is a widely ported operating system kernel available for devices ranging from mobile phones to supercomputers. The kernel type. The kernel is a program that manages the CPU resources, the memory resources, and the hardware resources on a computer. It also contains device drivers. For example, when the network interface card wants to talk to the network, it must go through the kernel. All hardware operations must go through the kernel. When a device starts, the kernel is what tells the flash memory to load the startup app. If the startup app needs memory, then it will be the kernel that will allocate the memory. The kernel is a complex piece of software using over 15 million lines of source code. The kernel can be modified, so you only have to use what the device needs. Linux uses a monolithic kernel, which is one program using one memory space. The kernel needs to be able to enable and disable parts of it depending on the device needs. This should be done at compile time, allowing you to add and remove configurations as needed. The monolithic kernel consists of 6 different layers. The application layer, this is the user mode. Virtual file system, a standard interface to deal with input-output requests. IPC file system, inter-process communications, allowing processes to communicate with each other. Scheduler, virtual memory, real-time schedulers that can use 2 different policies. Device drivers, dispatchers, device drivers and handlers to handle hardware interactions. And the bottommost layer, the hardware layer. This consists of the monitor, CPU, memory, disk, terminals, keyboards, and other devices. The devices. Over the years, the popularity of Linux has increased. It runs on devices of various sizes, power, and is built for diverse purposes. Linux is, like technology itself, deeply integrated in our daily lives, and we do not seem to even realize it. Specialized distributions and kernel forks exist for a less mainstream architecture. For example, embedded systems that target specific user groups, or support for a real-time system application. As of 2015, 400 Linux distributions are actively being developed, with about a dozen distributions being the most popular for general-purpose use. The desktop environments that have been developed use all open-source software and GUI front ends. GNOME, for example, has its Human Interface Guidelines as a design guide, which gives the human-machine interface an important role, not just when doing the graphical design, but also when considering people with disabilities and even focusing on security. ASUS and Acer have both designed netbook computers with Linux distributions installed on them. In 2011, Google announced the Chromebook, which has the Chrome OS installed, and of course, it is a minimal Linux-based operating system. For server, mainframes, and supercomputers, Linux distributions have long been used as server operating systems and have risen to prominence in that area. Linux distributions are the cornerstone of the LAMP server software combination: Linux, Apache, SQL, Perl, PHP, Python, which has achieved popularity among developers and is one of the more common platforms for web hosting. For mainframe systems, IBM predominantly sells mainframe-based enterprise Linux servers. Today, just about all supercomputers run a Linux distribution. Embedded devices often use some type of Linux-based operating systems. These systems are cheap and easily customized to fit the needs of customers and equipment. Many routers, music synthesizers, tone generators, and stage lighting systems all run from some version of a Linux-based operating system. Of course, you might expect these things all run on Linux, but a couple of things that run on Linux that you may not expect are cars and home appliances. Cars are more than engines and good-looking bodies. They are also complex computing devices, so of course, Linux runs inside them. No one has ever bought a car for its operating system, but Linux is already powering the infotainment, heads-up display, and connected car 4G and Wi-Fi systems for major car manufacturers such as Toyota, Nissan, and Jaguar Land Rover. And Linux is on its way to Ford, Mazda, Mitsubishi, and Subaru cars. For home appliances, the first thing that comes to mind is the Nest thermostat. This device uses Linux because some sort of operating system must take care of the main applications that run on it, as well as facilitate the use of Wi-Fi and other input-output. Again, Linux is also open and easy to configure, what makes it an ideal choice. The flavors. Linux distribution supports dozens of programming languages. The original development tools used for building both Linux applications and operating system programs are found within the GNU toolchain, which includes the GNU Compiler Collection, GCC, and the GNU Build System. Amongst others, GCC provides compilers for Ada, C, C++, Go, and Fortran. Many programming languages have a cross-platform reference implementation that supports Linux. For example, PHP, Perl, Ruby, Python, Java, Go, Rust, and Haskell. First released in 2003, the LLVM project provides an alternative cross-platform open-source compiler for many languages. Proprietary compilers for Linux include the Intel C++ compiler, Sun Studios, and IBM XL C++ compiler. BASIC, in the form of Visual Basic, is supported in such forms as Gambus, FreeBasic, and XBasic, and in terms of terminal programming or QuickBasic or Turbo Basic programming in the form of QB64. Since Linux is free and open source, it makes it flexible and possible to tune for specific purposes. There are two main methods for creating a specialized Linux distribution: building from scratch or from a general-purpose distribution as a base. The distribution often used for these purposes include Debian, the Universal Operating System, an operating system that is a set of basic programs and utilities that make your computer run. Fedora. Fedora is a Unix-like operating system based on the Linux kernel and GNU programs, developed by the community-supported Fedora project and sponsored by the Red Hat Company. Ubuntu. Ubuntu is an open-source software operating system that runs from the desktop to the cloud and to all your internet-connected things. Arch Linux, a simple, lightweight distribution. Gentoo, a flexible, source-based Linux distribution that becomes just about any system that you need, and much more. In contrast, Linux distributions built from scratch do not have general-purpose bases. Instead, they focus on the JEOS, just enough operating system philosophy by including only necessary components and avoiding resource overhead caused by components considered redundant in the distribution's use case. Many Linux operating systems manage a remote collection of system software and application packages that can be downloaded through a package manager such as apt or yum. These managers allow you to install, update, and uninstall all from one central location. These managers use a network connection to download and install packages. Games and Linux. Linux gaming refers to playing and developing video games for the Linux operating system. Involving a Linux kernel-based operating system, often used for all computing tasks like surfing the web, office applications, and desktop publishing, but also for gaming. Linux gaming started as clones of popular arcade games and text adventures. As the operating system grew in popularity, so did the game development. In 1994, the first commercial video game was ported to Linux, and following that, several major game development companies started developing games for Linux. Some of the first games to be ported to Linux included Doom, Quake, SimCity, and Ultima Online. Many of the game development tools and engines are available for Linux, with most of them being cross-platformed. Most are free and open-source software. Linux supports high-resolution multi-monitoring through AMD, and Voice over IP is supported for voice chat. There are numerous emulators for Linux. There are also APIs, virtual machines, and machine emulators that provide binary compatibility. Valve officially released Steam for Linux on February 14, 2013. As of November 2016, the number of Linux-compatible games on Steam exceeds 2,000. Steam plays a cross-platform multiplayer, so you can buy once and play anywhere. Valve has made a custom version of the Linux kernel, based off of Debian 8 code named Jessie. It calls it SteamOS. This has been optimized for a living room experience. SteamOS is intended to be used for home theater PC gaming, otherwise known as a media center. Valve stated that it had added support for movies, television, and music functionality to SteamOS. However, the video content is only from Steam's store, which has a small amount of films, while music playback only supports local music collections. In October 2015, an update allowed Netflix and other DRM-protected content to function in the native built-in browser. Conclusion. This paper has taken you through a brief introduction of the Linux kernel, starting with Linus Torvalds needs to simplify the computer for himself. Next came a short look at the different types of devices that run on a Linux kernel or a modified version of it. Then we looked at the different flavors of Linux and how it was all mostly open source software and very flexible. And finally, we took a short look at game development on Linux, a new kind of living room entertainment, showing you can have fun on a Linux box. It's just not for work.